The rain started at 4 in the morning and Diana Reyes had been awake since 3, sitting in the driver's seat of her 2009 Corolla with the engine off and the windows fogging from her own breath, watching the parking lot of Redwood Grace Baptist fill with silver water. Mara slept in the back seat under 2 sweaters and Diana's coat, her breathing slow and even, oblivious to the kind of cold that works through metal and glass like it has somewhere to be. The stuffed rabbit she called Juniper was pressed against her cheek. 8 years old and still sleeping like she had nothing to worry about. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. She did. They both did. The parking lot had been their home for 11 nights. The church pastor, a man named Gerald Whitby with kind eyes and limited patience, had given them permission to use it when Diana knocked on his office door 17 days ago, carrying Mara on her hip, and 2 garbage bags of belongings, and no particular story except the one written on her face. He hadn't asked questions. He'd pointed to the far corner near the dumpsters, away from the street, and told her to park there and come in for hot meals on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. She'd thanked him and meant it. Whitby had knocked on her window 5 days later with an apology and a name and a number. His deacon board had raised concerns. Liability. Insurance. The usual language people use when they mean something smaller and harder to say out loud. He gave her the card of a women's shelter 20 miles north. She'd called. The waiting list was 6 weeks. So she stayed in the lot and moved to a different corner and hoped the deacon board didn't look too carefully. The rain drummed harder on the roof. Mara shifted and made a small sound like a question no one had asked yet. Diana's phone had 7% battery. She plugged it into the car charger, but the charger had been dying for weeks, adding power slower than the phone spent it. The notification she'd been dreading for 3 days sat at the top of her screen. Her bank balance was $42 and some cents. Her next paycheck, from the overnight cleaning job she'd picked up at the convention center in Gresham, wouldn't come for 8 days. She did the math she'd been doing for 2 months. It never came out differently. $42. 8 days. A child who needed breakfast. A car that needed gas to get to the cleaning job that paid for gas and breakfast and nothing else. In the rearview mirror, she watched Mara's face. Round cheeks still carrying the last softness of childhood, dark hair fanned out against the seat cushion, her grandmother's mouth and Diana's stubborn jaw even in sleep. 3 months ago, they'd had an apartment in Northeast Portland. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen window that caught afternoon light, a school 3 blocks away where Mara had a best friend named Clarice, and a teacher who kept calling Diana to say her daughter was exceptionally sharp at math. They'd had a life that wasn't perfect, but was theirs. Then Garrett Colton had called Diana into his office on a Thursday afternoon and told her she was being let go. Restructuring. Organizational realignment. He'd used the words with the practiced ease of a man who'd delivered this speech many times and never once lost sleep afterward. Diana had sat across from him in the leather chair reserved for important conversations and understood, even as the words kept coming, that this had nothing to do with restructuring. She'd spent the previous 3 weeks compiling figures she hadn't been meant to find. A property management company owned by Colton's brother-in-law, pulling contracts from Colton properties at rates that bore no relationship to market value. Shell companies in Delaware receiving payments for consulting services nobody had performed. Vendors appearing in the payable ledgers whose addresses traced to residential properties in Marin County. She'd found the first thread by accident while reconciling quarterly reports, pulled it out of simple curiosity, and watched 8 years of fraud unravel across her spreadsheet. She'd made copies. She'd planned to go to the state attorney general's office. She'd told no one. Someone told Colton. He gave her 2 weeks severance and a letter of reference, so vague it was functionally useless. Within 30 days, every accounting firm in Portland had declined to interview her. Within 60 days, her landlord received a letter from Colton's attorney citing a lease violation Diana had never actually committed, and she was given notice to vacate on grounds of alleged subletting. She tried to fight it. The attorney she found would take the case for $12,000 up front. She had $600 in savings. She'd taken her copies of the fraud to the attorney general's office anyway, on the bus, holding a manila envelope, feeling like someone in a film. The intake clerk had been polite and entirely noncommittal. She hadn't heard back. That was 49 days ago. The thing about watching your life come apart was that it didn't happen all at once. It happened in increments small enough that you kept expecting the next day to be different, right up until the morning you woke up in a church parking lot and understood that the next day was not going to be different at all. Diana had spent years being careful. She'd built a career by being careful, by paying attention to numbers and finding the errors others missed. She'd raised Mara carefully, scheduled and fed, and put to bed with stories and kissed on the forehead with the particular ferocity of a mother who knew that children needed to feel held, not just provided for. She'd been careful and precise, and the city had come for her anyway, not with any drama or violence, but with the quiet machinery of people who had power and used it as casually as breathing. She thought sometimes about what it meant that the evidence she'd gathered, the thing that had cost her everything, was sitting in a government office somewhere being processed by someone who had a full desk and a lunch break and no particular reason to move fast. The fraud she'd documented affected no one she knew personally. It was institutional and systematic and invisible to ordinary people, and that made it, she'd come to understand, much easier to ignore. Diana turned off the phone to save the remaining 7%. Outside the church parking lot, Portland kept moving in the rain. A delivery truck passed. Someone's porch light came on across the street, clicked off again. The city was indifferent in the way cities are, too large to notice one more person coming undone at its edges. She had a sister in Sacramento who had sent $300 2 months ago and hadn't answered her calls in 6 weeks. A college friend in Seattle who'd expressed sympathy by text and then gone quiet. A mother who died when Diana was 12, leaving behind almost nothing except a small wooden jewelry box, a last name Diana had never thought much about, and the particular kind of loneliness that follows a child who loses a parent too early and learns to carry it like something fragile. What Diana also had, at the very bottom of the manila envelope under the driver's seat with the fraud documents, was a folded piece of paper she'd received 3 weeks ago from the county recorder's office in Clatsop County, Oregon. She'd almost thrown it away. It had arrived forwarded through her old building's mail, forwarded again through her sister's address, a piece of paper that had been chasing her across the state for 2 months before finally catching up. The letter was from an estate attorney named Benjamin Holt, representing the estate of Ruth Agnes Vance, deceased October 14, 2024. The estate included several parcels of property in and around the town of Millhaven, Oregon, being liquidated to settle debts. One parcel, listed as the Vance Mill property at the end of Copper Creek Road, was being offered at $300 to any buyer willing to accept it in as-is condition with no warrants or representations, given the property's current state of flood damage and the estate's inability to invest in remediation. $300. She'd read the letter 4 times in the parking lot of the women's shelter where she'd gone to add her name to the waiting list. She'd spent an hour on her phone's dying battery reading about Millhaven, Oregon. Population 840. A mill town that had never recovered from the closure of the timber operations in the 90s. Median household income $16,000 below the state average. The kind of place that appeared in news articles about rural decline and disappeared from everything else. But the houses there cost $30,000. Sometimes less. The kind of numbers that didn't exist in Portland or anywhere near it. $300 for a flooded mill was not a home. It wasn't shelter. It was a wet building in a dying town that an estate was trying to rid itself of before the property tax bill came due. But it was land. It was a deed with her name on it, which was more than she had now. She pulled the letter from under the seat and read it again by the pale light coming through the rain-blurred windshield. Benjamin Holt's phone number sat at the bottom of the page. She had $42. A property deed in Millhaven would cost $300 plus whatever fees Holt charged. She had no idea what she'd do once she got there. She had no tools, no money, no plan past arriving. Mara made a small sound in the back seat. Half words, the fragments of a dream. Diana folded the letter back along its old creases. She called Benjamin Holt the next morning from a gas station bathroom, where the outlet worked and her phone could charge. He was 60 and matter-of-fact, the voice of someone who has administered the remains of many lives and lost the ability to be surprised by any configuration of human difficulty. He confirmed the property was available. He confirmed the $300 price. He explained the as-is clause in language designed to remove any misunderstanding. The mill had taken on 2 feet of standing water and mud from the creek overflow 16 months ago. Nobody had bothered to pump it out. The structure itself appeared sound, but hadn't been professionally assessed. The electrical system was disconnected. There was a hand pump on the property fed from the same creek that had flooded it, which he acknowledged was an irony he'd noted himself. He did not ask why she wanted it. He told her to wire the money to the escrow account, and he'd FedEx the deed to any address she gave him. Diana used the gas station ATM to check her balance. $42.17. She called her sister in Sacramento. No answer. She left a message that said she needed $260 and that it mattered. Then she sat on the concrete floor of the gas station bathroom and waited. Her sister called back 40 minutes later. The wire came through by noon. Millhaven sat at the bottom of a valley in Clatsop County where 2 creeks met, and a stand of Douglas fir had once been the kind of resource people built their lives around. The firs were gone now, logged out and replanted and logged again until the industry moved on and left the town, holding a name that no longer described anything. Main Street had a diner, a hardware store, a post office open 3 days a week, and a row of storefronts with paper in the windows. Diana drove in on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, Mara awake in the back seat pressing her face to the glass, asking questions about the mountains and the fog and why all the buildings looked like they were thinking about falling down. They're old, Diana told her. Things look that way when they've been standing a long time. Mara considered this. Are we going to live in an old thing? Probably yes. Benjamin Holt's office was above the hardware store. He was exactly as his voice had suggested, gray-haired, unhurried, the kind of competence that comes from doing the same work in the same place for 30 years. He had the deed ready and didn't comment on the car packed with garbage bags or the child sitting on his office couch reading a book about horses. You understand the condition of the property, he said. I do. Creek overflow in the summer before last. Nobody's been inside since the Vance estate had it assessed 4 months after the flood. Assessment said structurally sound, but I'd get a second opinion if I were you. He slid the assessment across his desk. Also, I'll mention, because I'd feel strange not mentioning it, that the property has a reputation. Small town, old building. People attach stories to places. I've heard everything from a haunting to a buried fortune over the years. He said the last 2 words with the flat intonation of a man who did not believe in buried fortunes and had lived long enough to have opinions about people who did. What kind of stories? Diana said. He sorted his papers. Ruth Vance spent the last 30 years of her life convinced there was something hidden in that mill. Her grandfather built it in 1887. Gold processing operation mostly, though he ran grain through it too toward the end. Ruth believed he'd kept a private cache, off the books. She searched the property a dozen times that I know of and found nothing. By the end, she'd spent more money searching than the property was worth. He paused with the controlled sympathy of someone who'd watched a lot of people make expensive decisions. She had no children. The estate is modest. Hence the $300 asking price. Diana signed the deed. Holt notarized it. He handed her 2 keys on a plain metal ring. One for the padlock on the main door and one for a storage shed around back, and a hand-drawn map of the property showing the creek, the mill building, a stone foundation where a house had stood before the 1940s, and the shed. He also handed her a sealed envelope. Ruth Vance left this. It was to go with the deed to whoever purchased the mill. Diana took the envelope. She didn't open it in his office. The road to Vance Mill ran 2 miles east of town on a gravel track that softened to mud past the half-mile mark. Diana's Corolla made the trip with the determination old cars have when they have no choice. Mara watched the trees close in on both sides, fir and alder pressing against the track, branches brushing the roof of the car. I like it here, Mara said, with the absolute certainty of an 8-year-old who has not yet had to worry about structural integrity. Good. The mill came into view around the last bend, and Diana stopped the car and just looked at it for a moment. It was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories of weathered fir plank over a stone foundation, a wooden water wheel on the creek side that hadn't turned in decades, a roof that had held despite everything it had faced. The creek ran low and quick beside it. The yard was overgrown. Blackberry canes stretched across what had once been a path, and a lichen-covered sign on the post near the track still read Vance Mill established 1887 in letters she could barely make out. The flooding had left its mark. A brown tide line ran along the lower planks about 2 feet up, a record of the water's height, now dried and dark. Through the gap in the main doors, she could see the floor was still coated in the mud the water had left behind when it pulled back. Wow, Mara said. Diana said. It's enormous. Like a castle. Castles don't usually have mud in them. Mara thought about it. Some probably do. Diana sat a moment longer in the car and did the calculations she'd been running for 3 days. The cleaning job in Gresham was gone now. She'd given notice. She had no income. The remnant of $42 Holt hadn't needed, and a flooded mill in Clatsop County with a reputation for buried fortunes that an old woman had spent her life chasing and never found. She had also, still unopened in the pocket of her coat, the envelope Ruth Vance had left. Let's see it, she said to Mara. They got out of the car. The padlock on the main door was stiff but functional. It took both hands to get the key to turn, the metal thick with rust that hadn't quite fused the mechanism. The doors themselves were heavy planked wood, swollen from moisture, requiring Diana's shoulder to get them moving. When they finally gave, the smell hit her, standing water and mud and old timber, and something else beneath all of it, something mineral and cold, like the inside of a well. The main floor was 20 feet of open space, 2 inches of dried mud over the original wide plank boards, the residue of the flood deposited in waves and dried into a cracked gray skin. The millstone sat at the center, a massive granite wheel in a pit that had collected the most mud, sitting dark and patient. Wooden beams crossed overhead, heavy and apparently sound. No visible sag, no daylight showing through the roof above. A loft ran along the north wall, reachable by a ladder that Diana tested carefully before trusting it with her weight. Mara had gone in before Diana could stop her and immediately crouched to examine the dried mud with the concentrated attention of someone discovering an excavation site. Don't touch your face, Diana told her. I'm not touching my face. Mara's hands were already gray. The windows on the creek side were intact, 6 panes each, the glass old and slightly warped. Light came through them in long rectangles, catching the dust they disturbed by opening the doors. Along the east wall, wooden shelving still stood, built into the frame of the building, mud having settled onto the lower shelves. Tin cans rusted through. Rotted burlap sacks reduced to shreds. A row of glass jars, intact, contents dark and unidentifiable. A hand-forged iron hook driven into a beam at eye level that showed no intention of going anywhere. In the back corner, partially collapsed, was what had once been a small office. For walls of rough-cut planks, the door fallen inward, a desk visible through the gap. Mara ran her hand along the millstone and asked if this was really theirs. Diana leaned in the doorway. The deed was in her coat pocket. Ours. Are we going to live in it? That's the plan. Mara turned around, taking in the mud and the rust and the collapsed office and the smell. Her expression held that particular blend of honesty and loyalty children manage before they learn the adult version of lying, which is silence. Okay, she said finally. We can make it nice. Diana breathed out through her nose. That's the plan too. They spent the first night in the car anyway. Diana wasn't ready to sleep on a mud floor, and Mara, for all her optimism, didn't argue the point. They ate peanut butter crackers and watched the creek through the windshield, the water dark and running fast from the afternoon's rain. At some point Mara fell asleep mid-sentence about a book she'd been reading, and Diana sat awake listening to the mill settle in the wind, the old wood speaking in groans that were the language of buildings long past caring what they sounded like. She opened Ruth Vance's letter. The handwriting was careful and old-fashioned, the kind produced by someone who had learned to write when penmanship still meant something. To whoever holds the deed, it began. My grandfather built this mill with his hands in 1887. He was 26 years old and had come west from Pennsylvania with almost nothing and the intention of making something out of nothing. He succeeded for 50 years. When he died in 1943, he left the mill to my father, who didn't want it, and then to me, who wanted it too much. I spent 30 years looking for what I believed Eli kept inside that building. Let me be clear. I am not a foolish woman, and I do not have fantasies about treasure. I am a retired schoolteacher who kept my grandfather's records and correspondence and understood from reading them carefully that Eli Vance was a careful man who trusted banks less than he trusted stone, and who wrote in 1939, in a letter to my father, that the family's future was secured in the mill and not to worry. My father dismissed this as sentiment. I believed it was instruction. I never found it. I tried. My knees gave out before my patience did, and then my health made the decision for me. I am leaving this letter because the mill deserves someone who will look at it as a place worth saving rather than a liability worth selling. If you bought this property for $300, you are either desperate or stubborn or both, and I have found that both qualities produce the kind of person who might actually look carefully. Look carefully. The floor knows more than it says. I am sorry I could not find it myself. I hope you do better. Ruth Agnes Vance, September 22nd, 2024. She had written it 22 days before she died. Diana folded the letter along its old creases and held it in both hands for a while. Mara slept. The creek moved. The mill sat dark and patient at the end of the gravel track, waiting the way old buildings do for someone to decide they matter. She read the letter a second time. A third. She kept catching on the phrase, "The floor knows more than it says," turning it over the way you turn a stone found on a walk, not sure yet whether it's something or just a stone. Ruth Vance had been a schoolteacher, a woman who believed in evidence and careful reading. She had not written that sentence carelessly. She'd written it knowing it was probably the last instruction she'd ever give, knowing that whoever opened this envelope would be the final chance for a search she'd spent 30 years conducting and never completed. Diana thought about what it meant to know you were running out of time and still choose to leave a door open for someone you'd never meet. She thought that was either optimism or love or both, and that she was not sure she'd known how to do either of those things in quite a long time. Word got around Millhaven the way it always does in small towns, not through any single announcement, but through the compound process of a new vehicle parked at the end of Copper Creek Road and two women at the diner comparing notes about who'd asked about the Vance property. By Wednesday morning, Diana knew this because she'd stopped at the diner for coffee and hot food, and the woman behind the counter, whose name was Sylvie, had asked her directly if she was the one who'd bought the mill. "I am." Sylvie was 60-something, compact, with the slightly suspicious warmth of someone who'd watched too many people come to Millhaven with plans and leave with regrets. She poured Diana's coffee without being asked and leaned on the counter. "What are you planning to do with it?" "Live in it, eventually. Fix it up." Sylvie was quiet for a moment. "The mill's been flooded since the summer before last. Nobody's touched it. You'll need pumps for the mud, new flooring probably. The electrical's been disconnected for 30 years at least." "I know. You got a contractor?" "No." "Money for materials?" Diana wrapped both hands around the mug. "I'm working on it." Sylvie studied her with the kind of assessment that happens in small towns, reading the car in the parking lot, and the child finishing eggs at the corner table, and the coat that had seen 3 winters already. She seemed to reach a conclusion. "Tom Greer at the hardware store owes me a favor from 2019 that I haven't called in yet," she said. "I'll tell him you're good for supplies on credit until you get situated." She straightened. "Ruth Vance ate breakfast here 3 times a week for 20 years. I'd like her place to amount to something." Diana looked up from the coffee. "I don't want charity." "I know you don't. I'm not offering charity. Credit is credit. You pay it back when you have it." Mara appeared at Diana's elbow, last bite of egg still in her mouth, asking if she could have more toast. Diana told her to ask the kitchen, and Mara went. Sylvie watched her go with the expression of someone arriving at a quiet verdict. "That one will be fine," she said, with the certainty of someone who'd assessed several thousand children over a long career. "However you landed here, that child is going to be fine." Diana's throat closed briefly. She drank coffee instead of responding. She heard from 2 other people before noon. A man named Pete Alcott, who ran a one-person handyman operation out of his truck, stopped by the mill while Diana was attempting to sweep mud with a push broom she'd borrowed from the hardware store. Pete was 55 and laconic. He assessed the mill floor, the water damage line, the collapsed office, and the mud without saying anything for several minutes. "You're going to need a pump," he said. "I have one." He said it without offering it. She said she'd pay him when she could. He said he knew, and left. He came back 2 hours later with an electric pump, a 200-foot drainage hose, and a generator to run both, since the mill had no power. He set it up without conversation. By 4 in the afternoon, the pump was running and dirty water was moving out of the mill through the hose and across the yard toward the creek bank. The second person was a woman named Darlene Hatch, who ran the post office on the days it was open and seemed, by Diana's reckoning, to know everything that had ever happened in Millhaven and several things that had happened elsewhere. She arrived as Pete's pump was still running, holding a casserole dish and wearing the expression of someone delivering both food and opinion. The mill's been empty since 1943 when Frank Vance locked it up and moved to Portland, she said, handing Diana the dish. Ruth had a key, came up here every few years. She and I used to talk about her grandfather. She believed he kept something hidden in this building. Ruth was not a woman who believed in nonsense, so I take it seriously even if I don't know what to make of it. Darlene looked around the mill with the familiar gaze of someone who'd spent years hearing about a place. Eli ran the gold processing operation here from the late 1880s until about 1935. Miners would bring their dust and nuggets down from the claims in the hills, and Eli would process it, run it through the wheel and the sluice, do the assay work, charge 10% of the final weight. He was honest about it, which apparently made him unusual. She paused. The story I know is that Eli kept what he called his private accounting. The gold that came through the books didn't always match what miners reported delivering. Not a large discrepancy, small enough that nobody pushed. But over 50 years, small discrepancies add up. Diana thought about 50 years of small discrepancies. They do. Ruth figured her grandfather had a cache somewhere in or under the building. She believed there was a basement level according to the original construction records, but nobody's been able to find access to it in 30 years of looking. A basement. Darlene nodded. Original stone foundation. The plans Ruth found from 1887 show a lower storage chamber. But either the access was sealed over or it's hidden in a way that nobody's thought to look for. She paused. I thought you should know. Whatever Ruth was looking for, it's your property now. You have the right to look. Diana looked at the pump, still pulling mud water from the mill floor. The floor that was, slowly, becoming visible again beneath the dried sediment. The floor knows more than it says. By the end of the first week, the mill was a different place. Pete's pump had run for 3 days until the standing water was gone, and the mud was merely damp rather than liquid. Diana had spent those days pushing the dried mud into piles and hauling it out in a wheelbarrow Pete produced from somewhere, depositing it in the yard where the blackberry canes had been. Mara helped with the scale she was capable of, which was smaller loads and a growing interest in what the mud contained, which turned out to be 7 pennies, a brass button, 2 small bones she believed were from a bird, and a piece of dark green glass she insisted was an emerald, and that Diana gently confirmed was not. They were sleeping in the mill by day 4. Diana had bought 2 camping pads and 2 sleeping bags from the hardware store on Sylvie's credit account, and they spread them in the loft, driest part of the building, above the damp floor below. The generator Pete left ran a single extension cord connected to 2 work lights that turned the loft into a warm orange cave at night. Mara, who had apparently decided she was a pioneer, adapted to this with a completeness that Diana found both relieving and heartbreaking. She's not scared, Diana wrote in the small notebook she kept, more an accounting than a journal. She walks through the dark parts of this building like she already knows them. What Diana didn't write, because she wasn't sure how to, was that she'd started to feel the same way. The mill had a logic to it, a coherence in the way it was built that made sense the more time she spent inside it. Eli Vance had put this building together with the care of someone who intended it to last, and it had lasted through 130 years of weather and neglect and a flood that should have finished it. Each morning, she found something new to respect about it. The way the beams were joined, the depth of the stone foundation, the placement of the windows to maximize the light the valley offered for half the year. A careful man, Darlene had said. She was beginning to understand what that looked like in wood and stone. When the main floor was finally clear of mud, Diana stood in the center of the space and saw the building for the first time in its actual form. The wide plank floors were in better shape than she'd expected. 130 years of hard use had hardened the wood. There were sections near the collapsed office where moisture had gotten under the planks and warped them, raised edges and dark staining suggesting rot beneath. The millstone pit was the deepest problem, requiring the most cleanup, and she spent a morning on her knees in it with a bucket and a scrub brush. Pete came by on the 4th day with a friend named Garth who knew something about foundations. Garth walked the perimeter of the building, tapped the walls at intervals, crouched to look under the east shelf and the collapsed office, and came back to Diana with the assessment she'd been holding her breath for. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Foundation's solid, he said. This building was put up by someone who knew what they were doing. Those stones will outlast everything else by a century. He seemed personally satisfied by this, as if good masonry from 1887 was a vindication of something he believed for a long time. Darlene stopped by 2 days later with a box of Ruth Vance's papers, photocopied from the originals the estate had deposited with the county. Letters, construction records, the 1887 plans she'd mentioned. Diana spread them across the loft floor after Mara was asleep and read them with a flashlight, the night sounds of the creek and the trees filling the silence around her. The plans were hand-drawn on linen paper, faded but legible. 2 floors labeled, the main floor with the millstone and the water wheel mechanism, and below it a space labeled cooling storage, connected to the main floor by a staircase drawn in from the east wall. The staircase was marked in a location that, by Diana's reckoning of the current floor layout, sat somewhere beneath the collapsed office. The collapsed office that nobody had been able to get into since the flood. She also found, tucked between 2 pages of construction records, a letter Ruth had kept. It was from Eli Vance to his brother in Pennsylvania, dated June 1901, 14 years after the mill opened. The letter described the operation in practical terms, yields and costs, and the particular demands of processing or from the high claims, but it ended with a sentence Ruth had underlined in pencil. William, I have done well enough that the future is arranged, and I mean that more specifically than you might suppose. Ruth had written one word in the margin beside it, underlined twice. Where? Diana sat with the linen plans spread across her lap and looked at that single word for a long time. Where? The question Ruth had been asking for 30 years. The question Diana was now, somehow, also asking. She marked the spot on her copy of the plans with a pencil. She lay awake for a long time listening to Mara breathe and the buildings settle around them. Tom Greer at the hardware store advanced Diana $300 in supplies against future payment on Sylvie's word. 2 crowbars, a handsaw, a bucket of wood filler, sandpaper in 3 grades, and a new padlock for the main door. She spent the next day dismantling what remained of the collapsed office. The walls came down with more resistance than she expected, the wood still solid despite the decades, requiring the crowbar and patience and several minutes at a time when she simply leaned on the bar and waited for the joint to give. Mara handed her tools and moved pieces of wood to the stack in the yard with the proprietary interest of someone who considered herself co-owner of this operation. When the walls were down and the door cleared away, the office revealed itself as a space of approximately 10 by 12 feet. The desk still stood. The floor was muddier than the main area. The east wall behind the desk showed darker wood where water had run down it in a pattern too consistent to be random, a pattern that suggested the water had found a route it had used before. Diana crouched and looked at the east wall from floor level. There was a rectangle in the wood. Subtle, the kind of detail that didn't announce itself. Planks running horizontally instead of vertically, a seam at the floor line that was straighter than anything else in the building, and iron fittings at 2 corners that were not the same design as the hinges on the windows or the shelving hardware. Old hinges. A different kind of old. She put her hand flat on the planking and pushed. Nothing moved. She ran her fingers along the seam at the floor, found what felt like a lip, tried pulling toward her instead of pushing. Still nothing. Mara materialized at her shoulder. What is it? I don't know yet. It looks like a door. Diana sat back on her heels and looked at it again, with Mara's framing applied to it. It did look like a door. A door set into the east wall, just above floor level, maybe 2 feet tall and 4 wide. Not a wall panel, but an access point. And the rectangle of floor in front of it was a different shade from the rest, cleaner, as if it had been used more often, and so had accumulated less of a century's worth of grime. She came back the next morning with fresh eyes and found the latch. It was set into the wood so flush she'd missed it the day before, a small iron bar pivoting on a pin, designed to be almost invisible, designed by someone who understood the value of things that didn't announce themselves. She lifted the bar. The door didn't swing. It pulled toward her, and she took it in both hands and pulled, and felt a suction release like something sealed for a long time losing its grip, and cool air came through the gap, cold and mineral, and completely different from the smell of the mill above. Below was darkness. Below was a staircase. Actual stairs cut into stone, going down. The cooling storage chamber from the 1887 plans. She sat on the floor with the door open and the dark below her, and did not go down that day. She needed a proper flashlight, and she needed to think about what this was and what it meant. She closed the door carefully and replaced the latch and sat against the east wall with her hands on her knees for a long time, listening to Mara still talking to the millstone about fossils in the main room. She told Pete about it that evening when he came by to check on the generator. He looked at her for a moment and then said he'd bring better flashlights. She told Sylvie about it when she stopped at the diner the next morning. Sylvie put down the coffee pot and looked out the window in the direction of Copper Creek Road and said, in a way that was almost too quiet to catch, Ruth would have wanted to know that. Then she picked the coffee pot back up and went to fill someone else's mug and didn't say anything more. She told no one else. She told herself she was waiting for Pete's flashlights. What she was actually doing was trying to prepare herself for whatever was down there, knowing it was probably nothing. Knowing Ruth Vance had spent 30 years searching this building. Knowing the assessment Garth had done had found no access point anywhere. Knowing that this door had been sealed and that she had been the one to find it. $300 for a flooded mill. And there was something else she kept thinking about that she couldn't quite place. When Darlene had brought the box of Ruth's papers, she'd mentioned one thing in passing that Diana hadn't asked her to explain, and Darlene had moved on before Diana thought to follow up. She'd said, Ruth believed the flood water was protecting it somehow. Diana had taken that as a figure of speech at the time, the way people talk about things they care about, as if those things have agency. But standing in the mill each day, watching the floor dry and the mud come away and the wood emerge cleaner than it had been in decades, she started to wonder if Ruth had meant it more plainly. That the flood had sealed something. That the 2 feet of standing water that had sat in this building for 16 months had done something to the floor that the decades before it hadn't. Had settled sediment into seams. Had compressed dried mud into crevices. Had, in short, hidden something more completely than the years of ordinary dust and grime and foot traffic had managed to do before. She opened Ruth Vance's letter again on the 12th evening and read it twice. She opened the manila envelope and looked at the copies of Garrett Colton's fraud documents, the bank records and the shell company ledgers and the transfer receipts, the evidence that had cost her everything and still hadn't produced a consequence for anyone except her. She thought about the Attorney General's intake clerk. She thought about Mara sleeping in the loft on a camping pad. She thought about Eli Vance, 26 years old, building this mill from stone and fir with the intention of making something out of nothing. Honest, Darlene had said. Made him unusual. She put everything away. It was Mara who found the second door. Not the staircase door in the east wall, which Diana had kept latched and said nothing about. The other one. The one nobody had ever found in 30 years of searching. They'd been cleaning the millstone pit on a Thursday afternoon, the 14th day. Diana working with the hand scrub, Mara doing what she called helping, which meant crouching at the outer edge of the pit and examining the granite surface with the flashlight Pete had finally brought over, conducting her ongoing investigation of what she believed was a fossil embedded in the stone. The cleaning had found its own rhythm. The scrub brush, the bucket, the slow emergence of the original floor from under the mud's record of the flood. The pit was 2 feet lower than the main floor, cut into the original planking to accommodate the millstone. Diana had been working her way around its perimeter from inside, Mara following the outer edge. At some point, Mara moved past the deepest corner, past where the shadow from the main floor's edge fell heaviest, into the part of the pit where light had never quite reached, the corner the building had kept to itself for 130 years. Diana had her back to her. Mara said, "Mom." Something in the word made Diana turn around immediately without knowing why. Mara was kneeling. She had the flashlight aimed at the floor of the pit, not the millstone. Her face held an expression Diana hadn't seen before on her daughter. Something past surprise and before understanding. A look of encountering something that the available categories couldn't quite contain. "There's something here," Mara said. Diana crossed to her, crouched beside her. Mara moved the flashlight. The floor of the millstone pit at that corner was different from the rest. The planking ran in a direction that broke from the pattern of the boards around it. And where two planks met, there was a seam that wasn't flush, a seam with a lip to it. But that wasn't what Mara was pointing at. The seam was glowing. Not brightly, not like fire or anything electric. A warm amber light, thin as thread, running along the seam where two planks met at the edge of what could only be a door. This one set horizontally into the pit floor, nearly invisible under the last of the dried sediment that hadn't been reached yet, a door pointing down into whatever lay beneath the mill's lowest level. Diana reached out and touched the seam. The warmth came through her fingertips. Not cold, the way the rest of the floor and the stone and the November air all ran cold in that pit. Warm. The specific, steady warmth of something that had been sealed for a very long time and maintained its temperature against the world outside by virtue of being completely closed off from it. She thought of Eli Vance and 50 years of gold dust moving through this building. Gold that settled into the grain of old wood. Gold that worked its way into the seams over decades of processing. Gold that even 30 years of searching hadn't found because the person looking had been standing on it. When Mara's flashlight hit those seams at the right angle, it didn't just catch dust or old wood. It caught something older than that, something that had been accumulating since 1887 in the one place no one had thought to clean. Mara's eyes came up to meet hers. "What is it?" Diana put her ear close to the floor. Below the sound of the creak and the generator and the wind in the trees, she heard nothing. No machinery, no fire, just the building settling, the old sounds. And underneath those the faint pressing warmth of air that had been trapped in stone for longer than either of them had been alive. "I don't know yet," Diana said. This was becoming, she thought, the most honest answer she'd given anyone in months. She said it again, quieter, not quite to Mara. "I don't know yet." She looked at the amber line at the seam. She looked at her daughter's face. She looked at the door. She would need to be careful about this. She would need Pete and his flashlights and Garth who knew about foundations. She would need to think clearly about what was beneath a mill that an honest man had built in 1887 over a cooling chamber no one had been able to access in 30 years, a chamber warm enough to push heat through a sealed seam on a cold November afternoon. Mara pressed her small hand flat against the door in the floor, the same way Diana had pressed against the door in the east wall, and felt what Diana had felt. "It's warm," Mara said. "It is. Like something's alive down there." Diana sat back on her heels. Mara kept her hand on the floor. Outside, the creek ran fast over its stones. The mill around them held itself very still, the way old buildings do when they understand that something is about to change. Diana had $300 invested in this building, $1,100 in debt to a hardware store, a manila envelope full of evidence that nobody had acted on, a car with 200,000 miles on it, a sleeping bag in a loft, and a letter from a dead woman who had spent 30 years looking for exactly this. She picked up her flashlight. She got to her feet. She put her hand on Mara's shoulder. "Tomorrow," she said, "we do this properly." Mara looked up at her. "What are we doing properly?" Diana looked at the door in the floor. The amber seemed still glowing faint and steady in the beam of the flashlight, warm against November, warm against everything the last 3 months had been, warm like something that had been waiting with the patience of stone and time and 50 years of careful, honest work. "Whatever Eli Vance built this to hold," she said. She didn't sleep much. The loft was dark by 10 o'clock and Mara was under her sleeping bag by 10:15, still wearing the expression of someone who had touched something extraordinary and was processing it the way children do, by falling asleep with it still in their hands. Diana lay on her camping pad and listened to the building and thought about the amber seam in the pit floor until it was past 2 in the morning, and she gave up on sleep and sat up with her notebook and the copy of the 1887 plans. She measured distances by memory, tracing the dimensions Eli Vance had drawn with her finger on the linen paper. The cooling storage chamber sat below the main floor at a depth that the plans labeled as 12 feet. The staircase she'd found behind the east wall panel descended at an angle that, given the floor-to-chamber distance, would require roughly 30 steps. The chamber itself was drawn at 20 by 24 feet, a square almost as large as the mill's main floor above it. In one corner, Eli had drawn what appeared to be shelving, a long wall of it. In another corner, a small table. The dimensions of the shelving ran along the full north wall, 14 feet of it, drawn with careful hatching that architects used to suggest something solid and built in. She turned the plans over and held them up to the work light. In the top right corner, barely legible, a note in small handwriting that she'd missed before. It said, "Stone shelf, iron backing, 12 inches deep." Eli had built something into the north wall. Something with an iron backing. Something he'd specified in the plans with the kind of precision that people only use when the detail matters. An iron-backed stone shelf was not a place to store flour. Pete arrived at 7:30 with coffee in a thermos and 3 flashlights, and the kind of expression that meant he'd been awake thinking too. Mara ate cereal at the makeshift table Diana had fashioned from a salvaged board and 2 paint cans, watching the adults with the alert patience of someone waiting for the good part of the story to begin. "Are we going down today?" Mara asked. Diana looked at Pete. Pete looked at the floor. "We're going to look first," Diana told her. Carefully. Garth had said the foundation was solid. Pete confirmed this by his own standards, which involved tapping the east wall near the low door panel and listening to the sound with his ear close to the wood, then doing the same thing at 6 points around the perimeter of the collapsed office floor. When he straightened up, he gave a single nod that was the most reassuring thing Diana had seen in several weeks. They opened the east wall panel together, Diana lifting the iron latch and Pete taking the door in both hands and pulling with the controlled, unhurried strength of a man who has spent decades asking Wood to do things without forcing it. The suction released again, the same cold mineral breath coming up through the gap, and this time Diana had her flashlight ready. The stairs descended at a steady angle, cut from the same stone as the foundation, each step about 10 inches high and 14 deep. The craftsmanship was careful, the edges still sharp after 130 years. Whoever had cut these steps had taken time with them. The walls on either side were dressed stone, fitted without mortar in the old way, tight enough that the seams showed only as hairlines. Water had come through at some point, long ago, leaving pale mineral staining on the lower stones, but the passage was dry now and the air, though cold, wasn't damp in the way of active water damage. Pete went first, moving with the deliberate confidence of a man who has worked in confined spaces his whole professional life. Diana followed, keeping one hand on the wall. The stairs turned once at a landing cut into the rock, and then continued down another 8 steps before opening into the chamber below. Pete's flashlight swung in a wide arc. Diana stopped at the base of the stairs. The chamber was exactly as the plans had drawn it, 20 feet by 24, stone walls, stone floor, stone ceiling supported by 2 columns of dressed granite that Eli had left in place when he excavated around them. The ceiling was low, 6 feet at most, but Eli had known his own height and built accordingly. The air in the room was different from anything Diana had encountered in the building above. Steady and cool, around 50 degrees, the kind of stable temperature that stone maintains when it's sealed long enough against the world outside. Not damp, not stale the way sealed spaces usually were. Just old and even and utterly unchanged by the 16 months of flooding that had altered every other part of the property. Along the north wall, exactly where the plans showed it, the shelving ran from corner to corner. Iron-backed, as Eli had noted. Thick stone slabs set into brackets forged from flat bar that had been driven into the wall at intervals of every 18 inches. The shelving was 14 feet long and 5 shelves high. Every shelf 12 inches deep, every shelf occupied. Diana crossed the chamber in 3 steps. She reached out and touched the nearest object on the bottom shelf. It was heavier than she expected and cold through her palm, the specific weight and temperature of dense metal. She lifted it with both hands, and brought it into the beam of Pete's flashlight. A bar, roughly the size of a hardback book, rectangular with slightly rounded corners where the mold had given them that shape, the surface showing the texture of old casting, uneven but consistent. The color was unmistakable even before the flashlight confirmed it. Dull gold in the shadows, brilliant gold in the direct beam, the particular warm yellow that had no equivalent in any other metal on Earth. It was marked on its top face. EV, stamped twice, and a date, 1921. Pete made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Diana set the bar down carefully on the stone floor and lifted the next one. Then the next. Bottom shelf, 14 bars, each one marked with Eli's initials and a year ranging from 1902 to 1931. She moved to the second shelf. The same bars, the same markings, years extending back further, 1891 through 1901. Third shelf, more bars, some of the older ones showing a slightly different casting technique, as if Eli had refined his process over time. The dates went back to 1889. She stood back and looked at the full extent of the shelving. 5 shelves, 14 feet. The bars were not uniform in size, some considerably larger than others, but most were roughly the same weight. And as she moved from shelf to shelf, she understood that Eli had organized them by year, every bar marking a year of private accounting, a year of small discrepancies that only added up if you were paying attention over a very long time. She did the rough count in her head. The number of bars, the approximate weight of each, the current price of gold per troy ounce. Her accounting background assembled the calculation automatically before she could stop it. Her legs decided not to work properly for a moment, and she put one hand on the iron shelf bracket and stood there looking at what a careful, honest man had built in the dark under the Oregon hills over 50 years of quiet discipline. Pete was still standing near the stairs. His voice came out steady, which she appreciated, because nothing else felt steady at the moment. How many do you count? She counted again more carefully. 172 bars across all 5 shelves, plus 3 separate bars on the top shelf that were larger than the rest, perhaps twice the standard weight, marked only with the year 1938. The last year before Eli had died, she would later learn. Her accounting background was already past the rough calculation and into the refinements. 172 bars, most appearing to be roughly 20 troy ounces, some larger, some smaller. Call it 20 ounces average. 3,440 troy ounces of refined gold. Gold was trading at $2,040 per troy ounce as of last Friday, which was the last time she'd checked any financial news. She checked it obsessively, old habit from the work she'd done before Colton had dismantled her career. 3,440 troy ounces at $2,040 was $7,017,600. She said this number out loud, quietly, not quite to Pete, just to hear whether it meant something when spoken. It sounded impossible and also exactly as large as the shelves full of gold bars before her, which were impossible too, and yet were also undeniably real and cold and present in the beam of the flashlight. Pete exhaled slowly. He was not a man who expressed things dramatically, and he did not do so now. He just stood for a long moment with his flashlight pointed at the shelves and said, eventually, Eli Vance kept a secret for 50 years. He kept it for 136. In the far corner, near the small table Eli had drawn on the original plans, there was a wooden box. Not the iron-backed shelving, not the same craftsmanship as the chamber itself. A plain cedar box, 12 by 18 inches, with a fitted lid and a small brass latch that had tarnished to black. No initials on this one. No date. Just the box itself, dry and intact in the stable air of the sealed chamber, placed precisely in the center of the table, as if left there for someone to find. Diana took it up. The cedar smell came through even after all the years, clean and faint, the wood's natural oils preserved by the same sealed air that had kept the temperature constant and the moisture out. The latch moved on the first try. Inside, wrapped in oilskin that had been folded and refolded with the precision of someone who did everything precisely, were 3 things. The first was a ledger. Black leather cover, the same kind of ledger Diana had handled at Colton Properties, though this one was older by a century. She opened it and found Eli Vance's handwriting filling column after column. Dates, weights, amounts, the private accounting Ruth had always believed existed. Every transaction from 1889 to 1938 entered in the same meticulous hand, the figures adding up page by page to the fortune now sitting on iron shelves along the north wall. It was not the ledger of a man who was ashamed of what he was doing. It was the ledger of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and intended the record to survive him. The second thing in the box was a letter. 3 pages, the same handwriting as the ledger, dated October 4th, 1942. A year before Eli died. Diana unfolded it and read it standing in the chamber with Pete's flashlight over her shoulder. Eli had written it to his family, though he addressed it to no one by name. He wrote about the mill and what it had meant to him, about the 50 years of work he'd done there, and what he'd learned about gold and honesty, and the ways those two things could either support each other or destroy each other, depending on how a man handled them. He wrote about the miners who'd brought him there or entrusted him with it, and about the private accounting he'd kept and why. He'd skimmed not from greed, he wrote, but from a calculation he'd made early in his career and never abandoned. The claims in the hills would be exhausted. The miners would move on. The demand for processing would dry up. What he kept from each year's processing was insurance, not theft, because the amounts were small enough that no miner was harmed by them, and the wealth they represented would serve a purpose that the gold dust alone, scattered across 100 men's pockets, never would. He wrote about wanting his family to have options, about watching the boom and bust cycles of the mining economy and deciding that cycles were for people who didn't plan far enough ahead. He wrote about building the chamber, about the iron shelves and the cedar box and the stone stairs, about the decision to seal it rather than deposit the gold in a bank where a man's life work could be wiped out by a run or a collapse or a corrupt manager. Then, in the last paragraph of the final page, Eli had written something that Diana read 3 times before she fully understood it. I have not found a way to tell Ruth where this is. She is 10 years old, and I am 61, and there is not enough of my life left to be certain I can explain it to her when she is old enough to understand. I am putting this letter in the box because a letter waits for the right reader. If Ruth finds it, she will know what to do. If she does not find it, then whoever does will have to decide what to do with it themselves. I ask only that they use it for something that matters. He'd known. He'd known Ruth would spend her life looking and might never find it. And he'd accepted that. And he'd written the letter anyway, and left the cedar box on the table, and sealed the chamber, and gone home to his house on the hill above Millhaven, and lived another year, and died in the spring of 1943 with the secret intact. Diana folded the letter carefully along its original creases and held it for a long moment. The chamber was very quiet. The flashlight made the gold on the shelves glow in a way that had nothing theatrical about it, just the straightforward optical fact of metal catching light. She looked at the third thing in the cedar box. A folder, not Eli's. The paper inside was modern, the kind produced by a home printer, and the folder itself was the plastic kind you bought at any office supply store. On the tab, written in an elderly hand that was not Eli's, 2 words, for Diana. Diana's hands went still. She opened the folder. The contents had been assembled with the same care that Ruth Vance had brought to everything she'd done in 30 years of careful, patient searching. There were printed pages, articles from the Oregon Legal News Database, the kind of specialized publications that reported on professional misconduct and fraud cases. Diana recognized the subject matter of the first article before she'd read a word of the headline. It was about Colton Properties. It was about her. Ruth had known. Diana read the article slowly, though she knew its contents better than the journalist who had written it. Her name appeared in the 3rd paragraph, as the source who'd filed the initial complaint with the Attorney General. The article reported the complaint without resolution because it had been filed and was pending and nobody had yet decided to act on it. The article was dated 8 months ago, 5 months before Ruth Vance died. Behind the article, more printed pages. A property record search showing the ownership history of a Northeast Portland apartment building. Diana's building. The eviction notice filed against her. Behind that, a printout of a forum post on a legal aid message board where Diana had described her situation in the anonymous, practical language of someone trying to understand their options. Divorced, no child support, job loss tied to employer retaliation, eviction, child in school. She'd written that post 7 months ago from a library computer and received 3 replies, none helpful. Ruth Vance had found it. There was a handwritten note at the back of the folder. 2 sentences in the same careful handwriting as the letter Diana had read in the car on that first night in Millhaven. I cannot reach you directly, so I am leaving the door open instead. Diana sat down on the stone floor of Eli Vance's hidden chamber with the folder in her lap and did not try to manage what she was feeling. There was too much of it, and it was too old, all of it arriving at once. The grief of the past 3 months, the specific grief of being someone who had done the right thing and watched it cost her everything. The stranger grief of a woman she'd never met who had spent the last months of her life making sure Diana had somewhere to land. Pete crouched near her. He didn't say anything. He was good at that. After a while, Diana looked up at the shelves of gold bars, and at the cedar box on the table, and at the stairs leading back up to the mill above, and at the flashlight cutting through the dark of a chamber sealed for 80 years. She used to be a schoolteacher, Diana said. Pete nodded. Darlene said she taught at the elementary school for 32 years. She spent the last months of her life arranging this. Pete looked at the folder in Diana's hands with an expression that meant he understood the scope of what she was describing. Yes, he said. Seems so. Mara's voice came down the stairs. Mom, are you okay down there? Diana got to her feet. She was better than okay. She wasn't sure there was a word for what she was, not one that fit cleanly. She gathered the ledger, the letter, and the folder carefully back into the cedar box and latched it. She picked up a single gold bar from the bottom shelf, the one marked 1921, and carried it up the stairs with her. Mara was waiting at the top of the staircase panel, sitting on the edge of the opening with her feet dangling into the dark, juniper held in her lap. Her eyes went immediately to the gold bar in Diana's hand and stayed there. That's gold, Mara said. Real gold. Looks like it. From down there? From down there. Mara looked at the bar for a long moment with the seriousness she brought to things that mattered. Then she said, How much more is there? Diana thought about the north wall and its 5 shelves and the 172 bars and the 3 larger ones marked 1938. A lot, she said. They need to know what it's all worth. I mean exactly what it's worth. Mara said this with the practical certainty of someone who had been listening to adult conversations about money for the past 2 weeks and had drawn the relevant conclusions. I know, Diana said. I know exactly who to call. She called Benjamin Holt. Not because she needed a lawyer yet, though she would, but because Holt had been doing estate work in Clatsop County for 30 years and knew the landscape of it, knew who to call for what, knew the channels that needed to be used before a discovery of this kind became the kind of thing that attracted the wrong attention from the wrong directions. She described what she'd found in language that she kept neutral and factual, the habit of accounting working in her favor, and let the numbers do what numbers did. Holt was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then he said, with the careful understatement of a man trying to stay professional, That's a meaningful discovery, Miss Reyes. You're going to want to secure the property immediately and get a certified assayer in before you do anything else. Don't move the bars. Don't show them to anyone you haven't already shown them to. And call your bank. You're going to want documentation that this discovery predates any future claims. What kind of claims? He paused. The kind that people make when they read about a woman who bought a $300 property and found $7 million in it. She'd said the number out loud to Holt without quite meaning to, the automatic function of an accountant who'd already done the calculation and filed the result. He gave her a name, Thomas Aldrich, a certified precious metals assayer working out of Astoria, 40 minutes from Millhaven. He'd done estate work involving gold before. He was discreet. He was good. She called Aldrich. He answered on the second ring and listened to her describe what she'd found with the focused attention of someone who knew how to separate serious calls from nonsense before investing further time. He said he could be there the following morning. He said she should photograph every bar in place before anything was moved. He confirmed the current spot price of gold and walked her through the calculation she'd already done, arriving at the same figure she had. He said that figure was a floor, not a ceiling, and she should understand that before he arrived. A floor, she said. Mr. Aldrich's voice carried the quiet satisfaction of an expert about to perform the work he was best at. There's also the matter of the specimens. She hadn't mentioned any specimens. Natural crystalline gold specimens, he said. The kind that comes from high grade or before processing. If your man was running a gold processing operation for 50 years and he was keeping private stock, there's a reasonable chance he kept some of the ore that came through in its natural state. The specimens that show crystal formation. They're worth considerably more than the melt value of the same gold refined, because collectors and institutions pay a premium for natural crystal gold from Oregon. It hasn't been found in that form for 70 years. He paused. You might want to check the shelves again. She went back down before dark, alone this time, with Pete's best flashlight and the systematic attention of someone who has learned to look for what isn't immediately obvious. She started at the bottom left corner of the shelving and worked her way right, moving each bar to see what was behind it, checking the back of each shelf against the iron backing. Behind the third bar on the bottom shelf, she found a wooden tray. Behind the tray was a second tray. Both were divided into compartments. Each compartment lined with old felt that had compressed and hardened but still held its shape. Each compartment held a specimen. Crystal gold. The real thing. Exactly what Aldrich had described. Natural formations of pure gold that had grown in the or over millions of years before a miner's pick had freed them. Each specimen was different. One a flat plate of interlocking crystals 3 inches across. Another a branching tree of bright metal that looked more like something grown than mined. A third a thumbnail of massive gold so dense and pure it seemed to pull light toward it rather than reflect it. She counted the compartments. 28 specimens in 2 trays, ranging in size from a fingernail to a palm. She took the trays upstairs and set them on the makeshift table. Mara looked at them for a long time without touching. They look like they grew, she said. They did, Diana told her. Inside the rock, over a very long time. Mara reached out and touched the branching specimen with one finger, very gently. Like they were waiting. Diana looked at her daughter's face in the work light. Maybe, she said. Or maybe they were just being what they were, and were the ones who finally came along to notice. That night, Sylvie brought dinner without being asked. A pot of soup and a loaf of bread and 2 pieces of pie wrapped in foil, and she sat at the table with Diana while Mara ate the pie first and the soup second, and Sylvie asked no questions. She looked once at the cedar box sitting on the shelf Diana had salvaged and cleaned, and at the single gold bar sitting beside it. And she looked at Diana's face, and she said nothing at all, which was exactly the right thing. After Mara was asleep, Diana spread the contents of Ruth's folder across the loft floor and read everything again more carefully. The article about Colton Properties had been printed from a subscription legal database that Ruth had paid for through her public library account. It was the kind of small, persistent effort that required knowing what you were looking for. Ruth had not stumbled onto Diana's name. She had searched for it, and the searching had taken time, and she had done it in the months after her diagnosis when time was the one thing she had less and less of. The Forum Post was harder to think about. Diana had written it in a public library in Portland, sitting at a terminal between a teenager playing games and an elderly man watching baseball highlights. And she'd used a generic username and left out identifying details and submitted it into the anonymous stream of the internet and received nothing back worth keeping. Ruth had found it anyway, had read it and recognized something and connected it to the article and to a name and to a plan she was already making. The note at the back of the folder was 2 sentences. Diana kept coming back to those 2 sentences. I cannot reach you directly, so I am leaving the door open instead. She thought about what it meant to do that. To be dying and to spend your remaining months not on comfort or on the simple preservation of what remained, but on the engineering of a door left open for a woman you'd never met and couldn't contact, on the arrangement of circumstances so that the right person would have a path to take if they were desperate enough or stubborn enough to take it. There was something in that act that Diana recognized from her own life, from the way she'd spent 49 days holding on to evidence that nobody had acted on, still carrying the manila envelope, still unable to throw it away. Ruth had done the same thing on a different scale, had held on to something for 30 years because she believed it mattered, and at the end had found a way to pass it on. She lay down beside Mara on the camping pad and looked at the loft ceiling and thought about Eli Vance building that chamber with his own hands and placing the cedar box on the table and going home and dying and trusting that something would work out. She thought about Ruth spending 30 years looking and then finding a different way to finish the job in her last months. She thought about arriving in this town with $42 and a child and a garbage bag and buying a flooded mill that everyone in Millhaven had written off as a liability. The floor knows more than it says. Thomas Aldrich arrived at 8:15 the next morning driving a 10-year-old pickup truck with a locked equipment box in the bed. He was 60, broad-shouldered, with the hands of someone who worked with physical objects for a living and the eyes of someone who thought carefully before he spoke. He brought a portable scale, a spectrometer for non-destructive testing, reference materials, a camera, and a clipboard. He looked at the mill the way Garth had looked at the foundation, with the appreciation of a professional for work done by another professional from a different era. Pete made coffee on the camp stove, and they stood in the mill's main room while Aldrich read the copy of the 1887 plans Diana had pinned to the east wall. He traced the cooling chamber with one finger and nodded once, the nod of a man confirming something he'd suspected from the description. "Let's go down," he said. They went down together, Diana and Aldrich and Pete, with the work lights Pete had rigged on an extension cord from the generator, lighting the chamber properly for the first time. Aldrich stood at the base of the stairs for a full minute without speaking, looking at the shelving and at the bars arranged along the north wall and at the cedar box on the table, and his professional composure did something subtle to his face that Diana chose not to examine too closely, because she'd been trying to keep her own composure for 24 hours and didn't want to lose it now. He tested the first bar he touched with the spectrometer, holding the device to the bar's face and reading the result. Then he tested 3 more, selected from different shelves and different years. Each reading came back in the mid-90s, purity-wise, which was consistent with refined gold from a small processing operation working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He weighed a representative sample of bars on the portable scale, adjusting for the unit conversion between standard and troy ounces, and made notes on his clipboard with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of valuation many times. When he got to the specimens, he set his clipboard down. He lifted each tray out of the chamber and brought them up to the main floor, setting them on the table beside the cedar box in the natural light from the creekside windows. He went through the compartments with the careful attention of a collector who understood what he was looking at. He said nothing for several minutes. Diana waited. Mara sat on the millstone pit's edge and watched the adult transaction with the focused attention she brought to anything she decided was important. Aldrich picked up the largest specimen, the branching tree of natural crystal gold, and held it in the window light. He turned it. He set it down and picked up the flat plate specimen and examined the crystal faces with the small magnifier he wore on a cord around his neck. "Miss Reyes," he said, "these specimens are from the Cascades, probably from claims in the upper drainage above this valley. Natural crystal gold from this region has not been available to collectors or institutions in any significant quantity since the early 1950s. He set the plate down carefully. The last time specimens of this quality came to market, a single piece sold at auction in San Francisco for $280,000. Diana heard the number. She made herself stay still. "You have 28 compartments here. Some of these are exceptional by any standard. I would not want to give you a precise valuation without consulting with several specialist buyers and possibly auction houses. But a conservative floor for this collection, treating them as a group, would be somewhere between $4 and $6 million. Mara, from the millstone pit, that's more than the gold bars." Aldrich looked at her. "Yes, young lady, that's correct. How much is it altogether?" Aldrich looked at his clipboard. He looked at the specimens on the table. He looked at Diana. He said the number. $11.4 million as a conservative floor, assuming you sell the bullion at current spot and the specimens as a group to a single institutional buyer. If you sell the specimens individually at auction over time, the ceiling is considerably higher. Between 14 and 16 million is possible." He paused. "That's before we discuss the historical and documentary value of the ledger. An original record of a private gold processing operation from 1889 through 1938, fully documented, would be of significant interest to academic institutions and the Oregon Historical Society." He glanced at the cedar box. "I can't put a number on that without more research, but it's not nothing." Diana stood in the mill her ancestor's neighbor had built, in the building a woman she'd never met had arranged for her to find, holding a clipboard with a number on it that was the opposite of $42 in every possible way. She thought about Mara in the back seat under 2 sweaters. She thought about the Attorney General's intake clerk and the unopened manila envelope. She thought about Garrett Colton's leather chair and his 2 weeks of severance and his letter of reference, so vague it was functionally useless. She thought about Pete showing up with a pump without being asked, about Sylvie's credit account, about Darlene's box of papers, About Ruth Vance printing articles in a library on borrowed time and leaving a folder in a cedar box and writing 2 sentences in the careful hand of someone who had been a schoolteacher for 32 years and knew how to say precisely what she meant. She looked at Mara. Mara was looking at the specimens in the window light, watching them do what gold does when the sun catches it, which is something that has no equivalent and requires no explanation. Mara, she said. Her daughter looked up. Diana found that she couldn't say anything for a moment. The accountant in her had the full calculation assembled and cross-checked and was ready to present it. The rest of her was still catching up. We're going to be okay, she said finally. Mara tilted her head slightly, the way she did when an adult said something she'd already arrived at independently. I know, she said. I knew that when we found the warm door. Aldrich left in the early afternoon with his clipboard and his equipment box and a signed agreement to provide a formal written valuation within 10 business days. He also left a recommendation for a precious metals storage and transport company in Portland and the names of 2 institutional buyers who had standing interest in Oregon gold specimens. He shook Diana's hand at the mill door with the grip of a man who'd done a thing he was glad to have done and drove off down the gravel track toward the main road. Pete came to stand beside Diana at the mill door. The November afternoon was gray and cold, the creek audible, the treeline above the valley already going dark at 4 o'clock the way it did this time of year. What happens now, he said. Not a question exactly. Diana thought about Holt's advice. About securing the property. About documentation and bank records, and the kind of paper trail that made future claims difficult. She thought about the manila envelope under her car seat and the Attorney General's office and the complaint that had been pending for 49 days. She thought about the fact that Garrett Colton Properties had been expanding into rural Oregon counties. She'd seen it in the trade publications during the months she'd worked for them, before everything fell apart. Clatsop County had been mentioned. She hadn't thought about Millhaven specifically. She'd had no reason to. But the logic of a property developer looking for undervalued land in a depressed rural economy pointed directly at a town like this one. And the logic of a man like Colton, who made his money by knowing things before other people knew them, suggested that a story about a flooded mill and a discovery of gold would not stay contained in this valley for long. She needed to move faster than the news did. I need to call a lawyer, she said. Not Holt. Someone who does what I need done. Pete looked at her sideways. What do you need done? 2 things. She held up one finger. The inheritance secured legally, the discovery documented and authenticated, and the ownership chain established past any argument. She held up a second finger. And the fraud case. He looked at both fingers. That's quite a 2. A man named Garrett Colton fired me and destroyed my career and kicked me and my daughter out of our home because I found evidence of fraud he'd been running for 8 years. She heard the flatness in her own voice, the accounting voice, just the facts of it stated with no inflation or decoration. I've been carrying that evidence for 49 days and nobody has acted on it. Pete was quiet for a moment. You think he'll come for this? He doesn't know yet. But he will. Diana looked at the mill behind her, at the door she'd shouldered open 11 days ago, and which now opened easily on the dry hinges Pete had treated with oil. Small towns talk. Aldrich will tell no one. But someone will notice a certified assayer arriving on a gravel track, and someone will mention it over dinner, and someone will know someone, and eventually the information will travel. How long do you have? She did the calculation. A week. Maybe 2 if the weather keeps people inside. Pete looked at the darkening treeline. I know a lawyer in Portland. Retired prosecutor. She does civil litigation now, and she's been looking for a fraud case worth her time for 3 years. He said it without preamble, the way he'd said you're going to need a pump. As a statement of fact about a resource that existed and was available. Call her, Diana said. He pulled out his phone. While he made the call, Diana went back into the mill and down the stairs to the cooling chamber. She stood alone in the dark with the flashlight and looked at the shelves. Eli Vance's 136 years of patience, Ruth Vance's 30 years of searching, a folder assembled by a dying woman in a library, and $42 in a church parking lot on a rainy November morning. She tried to find the line that connected all of those things and decided that it wasn't a line but something else, the kind of logic that doesn't show itself until you're standing at the end of it and can see back along the whole length. She picked up one of the crystalline specimens from the tray. The branching one, the natural tree of gold grown over millions of years in the dark inside the rock. She held it in the flashlight beam and watched it do what gold does. Ruth had written, "I am sorry I could not find it myself." Diana held the specimen a moment longer. Then she set it back in its felt compartment and picked up the cedar box and climbed the stairs back up into the mill and went outside where Pete was finishing his call and stood in the cold November air with the cedar box under her arm and her daughter's voice audible through the mill wall asking Juniper what she thought they should do with all the money. The lawyer Pete knew was named Carol Prentice, and she answered Pete's call on the third ring and agreed to drive up from Portland in the morning. She said, before she hung up, something that Pete repeated to Diana afterward with the slight smile of a man who'd known it would land this way. Tell her to have her evidence ready. Real evidence. The kind that can't be dismissed. Diana thought about the manila envelope under the car seat. About 8 years of systematic fraud documented in ledgers and bank records and email chains. About 49 days of waiting. I have it, she told Pete. She always had. The following morning, Carol Prentice arrived at the mill at 9 o'clock sharp. She was 54, with silver-streaked hair pulled back and the kind of professional composure that had been put there by 30 years of watching people try to lie in depositions. She shook Diana's hand at the door, accepted coffee from the camp stove without comment on the circumstances, and set her own briefcase on the table beside the cedar box. She went through the evidence Diana had collected. Every page. Every figure. She went through Aldrich's preliminary valuation notes. She went through the 1887 plans and the county deed records and Ruth Vance's folder and Eli's letter. She read everything in the order Diana laid it before her, without interrupting, without telegraphing a reaction. When she was done, she sat back and looked at Diana in a way that meant something had shifted in her assessment. "Tell me about Colton," she said. "Everything." Diana told her everything. It took 2 hours and 2 cups of camp stove coffee and Mara coloring quietly at the end of the table, occasionally glancing up to check that the adults were still on task. Prentice took notes and asked precise questions at precise intervals and said nothing that was designed to reassure, because she was not the kind of lawyer who reassured people. She was the kind who listened carefully and then told you what the situation actually was. At the end, she closed her notebook. "You have a fraud case," she said. "The evidence you've provided is comprehensive. The Attorney General's complaint gave them the path. What they've lacked is someone with resources to pursue it in parallel through civil channels, which takes money and time." She looked at the cedar box. "You now have resources." Diana had already understood this. The inheritance and the fraud case were connected not by law, but by timing. For 49 days she'd had the evidence and nothing else. Now she had the evidence and $11 million in gold sitting in a sealed chamber under her floor, and the difference between those two situations was the difference between a complaint sitting in an intake stack and a complaint with a serious attorney behind it. "There's one more thing," Prentice said. Diana waited. "Colton Properties has been buying land in Clatsop County for the past 18 months. She opened her briefcase and produced a printed sheet, county parcel records, highlighted in yellow. He owns 12 parcels between here and the coast. Most of them agricultural, some commercial. He's been quiet about it, using an LLC that doesn't show his name on the first search. But it's his money." She looked at Diana. "He doesn't know about your discovery yet, but he will. And when he does, he's going to understand that the woman who filed a fraud complaint against him just became someone with resources to make that complaint very, very expensive for him to ignore." Diana thought about the leather chair in Colton's office, about the practiced ease of the restructuring speech, about the way his attorney's letter had arrived at her landlord's office so efficiently, so quickly, so precisely aimed. Men like Garrett Colton were dangerous when they had the power, and they were twice as dangerous when they understood they were about to lose it. "He'll move fast," Diana said. Prentice nodded. "So we move faster. I'm going to file an amended civil complaint by end of week. The Oregon AG's office will receive a copy. I'll also contact the FBI Financial Crimes Division, because some of those shell company transactions cross state lines, and that changes the jurisdiction." She closed her briefcase. "You're going to want to give a formal statement about this discovery to the county recorder's office before anything appears in any news source. Date stamp everything." "I understand date stamping," Diana said. Prentice almost smiled. "I thought you might." She stood. "I need you to understand something about what comes next. This isn't going to be quiet or easy. You have significant assets, and you have a credible case against a man who has spent 8 years making problems disappear and 2 years quietly buying land in the county where those assets sit. He will fight. His lawyers will look for any angle, and the fact that you bought this property for $300 will be used to suggest you couldn't have known what you were purchasing, and therefore some question exists about the validity of the transaction. She paused. That argument is going to fail because the deed is clean and the purchase was legitimate, and you have documentation of everything. But it will be made, and it will be loud, and you need to be ready for that. Diana looked around the mill. At the work lights Pete had strung. At the restored main floor, cleaned and swept, the wide planks visible at last. At the loft where Mara's sleeping bag was still spread out. At the east wall panel that opened onto a staircase that descended to gold and cedar, and the careful record of a man who had planned for the future with more precision than anyone had known. She thought about what ready meant after the past 3 months. After the parking lot, and the cleaning job, and the $42. She thought about Pete arriving with a pump without being asked, about Sylvie's credit account, about Darlene's box of Ruth's papers, about the morning she'd crouched in the millstone pit and felt warmth coming through the seams of an old floor. She thought about Mara saying, "I knew we'd be okay," when we found the warm door. She was ready. She had been, she understood, ready for some time. The past 3 months had not been a collapse. They had been a compression, the kind that happens to things before they decide what they are. Carol Prentice left just before noon with an agreement signed, and the digital copies of Diana's evidence on a secured drive she produced from her briefcase, with the efficiency of someone who had been in this business long enough to come prepared for every eventuality. She shook Diana's hand at the door again, this time with a slightly different quality to it. "I've been looking for a case worth the fight for 3 years, Prentice said. "Pete told me that on the phone. I want you to know he was right. This is it." She drove off down the gravel track the same way Aldrich had the day before, and Diana stood in the mill door and watched the truck go and thought about the 2 weeks she had, maybe less, before the story of the flooded mill and the hidden gold found its way to the ears of the wrong people. She had 2 weeks to build a wall high enough that no one could knock it over. Behind her, Mara's voice came from the loft, where she had been reading for the past hour. "Mom, can we go to the diner? I want to tell Sylvie." Diana turned around. The work lights cast the mill's interior in warm gold, the wide planks of the floor glowing where they'd been cleaned to their original color, the millstone sitting at the center, old and solid and patient. In the east wall, behind its panel, the iron latch waited on a staircase that descended into history and wealth and the complicated kindness of a dead woman. "Yes," Diana said. "Let's go tell Sylvie." The story reached the diner on a Thursday morning. Diana knew the moment she walked in and saw the way Sylvie looked up from the counter. Not the usual warmth of someone glad to see a regular face, but a sharper attention, the look of a person who has information they don't yet know how to position. 2 other customers were already there, a man Diana recognized from the hardware store and an older woman who taught part-time at the school, and both of them went quiet in the particular way that means the conversation before you arrived was about you. Sylvie set a mug of coffee on the counter and said, without preamble, "There was a car here yesterday asking questions. Portland plates. Man in a gray suit who said he was doing about the civil complaint now filed in an Oregon court with her name on it." And she thought about Garrett Colton somewhere in Portland looking at a report from a man in a gray suit who'd been parked outside a diner at 6 in the morning. He would move by Friday. She had until Friday. She spent Thursday arranging what she needed to arrange. Holt came by the mill in the afternoon with 2 documents requiring Diana's signature. A formal declaration of discovered property under Oregon statute, date-stamped and notarized, establishing her legal claim to the contents of the structure she owned. He also brought a security company out of Astoria, 2 men who installed a new lock system on the main door and a motion-activated camera covering the entrance to the cooling chamber stairwell. He did all of this with the unhurried competence of a man who had seen estates go wrong enough times to know what going right required. After Holt left, Pete came by with Garth, and the 3 of them spent 2 hours reinforcing the east wall panel door, installing a proper hinge and lock system on it to replace the iron latch that had held for 130 years but was not adequate to hold against people who decided they wanted what was behind it. Friday morning came with a letter from a Portland law firm called Hadley Crane & Weston, delivered by courier to the mill at 8:15, which meant the courier had driven from Portland through the night. The letter informed Diana that her client, Colton Properties Development Corporation, was filing an emergency motion to freeze all assets associated with the property at the end of Copper Creek Road pending adjudication of claims related to the estate sale of Ruth Agnes Vance, deceased, on grounds that the sale price of $300 did not reflect true market value and constituted a potential breach of the estate executor's fiduciary duty. Diana read the letter once, handed it to Prentice by photograph, and made coffee on the camp stove. Prentice called back within 20 minutes. Their injunction will be heard Tuesday. Judge is Warren Olds. I know his record. He's procedural, which means he follows the documents, which means we need to have better documents than Hadley Crane and Weston. She paused. Fortunately, we do. What they had was the clean deed. The formal declaration of discovery, date stamped 48 hours before Colton's letter arrived. The county deed records showing Evergreen Pacific Holdings rejected offer 18 months earlier. Ruth Vance's folder with its documented sequence of choices, the research, the article about Colton, the forum post, the 2 sentences in the handwritten note, and Eli Vance's ledger and letter, which established that the gold predated any surface transaction by over a century and had been part of the structure's contents since its construction. What they also had was something Prentice considered the most useful document in the file. A letter from Benjamin Holt explaining that Ruth Vance had consulted with him about the $300 sale price in the months before her death, and that she had been fully informed about the sale structure, had set the price deliberately, and had expressed in writing her understanding that the property would transfer with all contents, known and unknown, to whoever purchased it. Holt had kept a copy of that consultation in the estate file. He produced it with the air of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. She knew exactly what she was doing, Holt said, when Diana called to thank him. Ruth was one of the most precise clients I ever had. He paused. She asked me to witness that consultation document carefully because she thought it might matter someday. The hearing on Tuesday was not long. Judge Warren Olds was 62 and procedural, as Prentice had predicted, and he read every document placed before him with the attention of a man who trusted what was written over what was argued. Hadley Crane and Weston presented their motion with the polished confidence of a firm that charged $400 an hour and expected that to be persuasive by itself. They argued the estate had failed in its fiduciary duty. They argued the sale price reflected a failure of due diligence. They argued that their client had a prior interest in the property, referring to the Evergreen Pacific Holdings offer, which they framed as evidence of good faith engagement with the market. Prentice sat quietly through the presentation. She had the look of someone waiting for a bus she knows is coming. When it was her turn, she placed Ruth Vance's consultation document before the judge. She placed Holt's witness attestation beside it. She placed the discovery declaration, date-stamped and notarized, and she placed the property records showing a clean deed transfer with Diana's signature and the estate's signature and Holt's notarization and the county recorder's stamp. Then she placed the county records showing Evergreen Pacific Holdings' 12 Clatsop County acquisitions, with the 4 below-market purchases flagged in yellow. She said, without raising her voice, "Our position is that the sale was legally conducted by an estate executor acting in full compliance with her client's documented wishes, that the purchased property transferred to Miss Reyes with all contents intact as specified in the deed, and that the prior parties claimed interest amounts to a rejected offer made 18 months ago at a fraction of assessed value." She looked at the opposing counsel without any particular expression. We further note that the motion to freeze Miss Reyes's assets was filed within 72 hours of a complaint being lodged against Colton Properties Development Corporation in the 3rd District Court for fraud and predatory business practices, which raises questions about the timing and motivation of this injunction. The property researched for a client and wanted to know about recent sales in the area. Diana set her hands flat on the counter. "What did you tell him?" "That I run a diner, not a real estate office, and the coffee was $4. Diana almost smiled. "How long do you think he'd been in town?" Sylvie considered this. "The tire tracks out front when I opened suggested he'd been parked there from around 6 in the morning, which is before I arrived. So he talked to other people first. That was Wednesday. Aldrich had left Tuesday. Prentice had left Tuesday afternoon. 2 days. Diana had hoped for more, but she'd known better than to count on it. Small towns talked, and Clatsop County had no particular reason to keep the secret of a flooded mill and a woman who'd bought it for $300. And somebody had mentioned it to somebody who had mentioned it to someone whose job it was to mention things to Garrett Colton. She drank the coffee. She paid for it. She went back to the mill and called Carol Prentice from the parking lot. "He knows," she said. Prentice's response came immediately. "I filed this morning. The civil complaint is live." The AG copy went by courier, and the FBI financial crimes referral went by encrypted file transfer. She paused for one breath. "How much time do we have?" "Enough if we move today." "Who else is exposed?" "The property, obviously. He'll file for an injunction to freeze your assets before the end of the week if he moves the way I expect him to." Prentice's voice had the quality of someone running through a prepared scenario. "He'll argue the estate failed to disclose known value. It's a weak argument, but it'll buy him time if the judge is sympathetic, and he's had a presence in Clatsop County long enough to know which judges have had lunch with his lawyers." Diana had anticipated this. She'd spent 2 nights going back through the county records, and she'd found something Prentice hadn't mentioned yet, probably because she'd only just discovered it herself. She'd found it at 11 o'clock the previous night and had sat with it until past 1 in the morning, making sure she understood what she was reading. "One of Colton's Clatsop County LLCs," she said. "Evergreen Pacific Holdings. They made an offer on the Vance estate property 18 months ago, a month after Ruth was diagnosed." Silence on Prentice's end. A particular kind of silence. "He tried to buy the mill," Diana continued. "The estate rejected the offer as insufficient. The offer was $12,000. Then he let it go, or appeared to let it go, and moved on to other parcels. But the search history of his LLC shows they were tracking the property right up until Ruth died and the estate liquidation began." Prentice said, quietly. "He knew, or suspected." Diana looked at the mill's doors, propped open to the November air the way she propped them every morning now. The smell that came out was different from the first day, the mud and the standing water long gone, replaced by something that still held age in it, but had lost the rot. He may have known about the gold before he made the offer. He may have offered $12,000 because he thought he was being clever about an estate that had no heirs and no reason to hold out. When the estate rejected the offer, he backed off because pushing harder would have drawn attention. Then Ruth arranged the $300 sale specifically to get the property to someone outside his reach, Prentice said. Diana nodded, though Prentice couldn't see it. "That's what I think. This changes the case considerably." Prentice's voice had gone from professional efficiency to something with more current in it. "If we can demonstrate that Colton had prior knowledge of potential undisclosed value and attempted to acquire the property through a lowball offer to a vulnerable estate, that's not just fraud. That's predatory acquisition, and it connects directly to the pattern in the original complaint. He was doing in Millhaven exactly what he was doing in Portland." Diana had understood this since the night before, but saying it out loud made it settle differently, with more weight. "Different scale, same method. Then we use it." Prentice was already moving. "I need everything you have on Evergreen Pacific Holdings. Every document, every parcel, every transaction in Clatsop County. Can you get that?" "I already have it," Diana said. She'd pulled the county records at the library the previous afternoon, all 12 parcels, all 12 transactions. 4 of them had a pattern she recognized from her time at Colton Properties. Acquisition prices well below assessed value from sellers in financial distress. One sale dated 8 months ago was from a family named Harrow who had lost their farm income when the last dairy operation in the county closed. They'd sold 3 acres to Evergreen Pacific for $9,000 against an assessed value of $41,000. She sent the file to Prentice before the call was finished. Inside the mill, Mara was at the makeshift table working through a math assignment she'd been sent by her former school in Portland, continuing her coursework remotely while Diana figured out the next steps. Diana had enrolled her at Millhaven Elementary 2 days ago, and the principal had been matter-of-fact about it in the way of small school administrators who understand that children need continuity more than they need perfect paperwork. Mara would start on Monday. She had already, on the walk back from the school visit, identified 2 girls her age who lived in the rental properties on the south end of Main Street, and had reported this intelligence to Juniper with the confident efficiency of someone who intended to have friends by the weekend. Diana stood in the mill door and watched the creek, cold and clear, moving fast over its stones. She thought about the chambers below her feet and the $11.4 million that Thomas Aldrich had called a conservative floor, and she thought. Judge looked at the document stack. He looked at Hadley Crane and Weston. He looked at Prentice. He denied the motion. Hadley Crane and Weston's lead attorney was composure made flesh, and he did not show what he was feeling. But he took slightly longer than necessary to gather his papers, and that small extra time was the only visible evidence of the morning's damage. Outside the courthouse, Diana stood on the steps in the November cold and called Pete. He answered on the second ring. "We won," she said. Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Round one." He was right about that. She drove back to Millhaven in the late afternoon, the valley coming into view as she descended from the ridge, the town sitting in its bowl of hills with the creek running through it, and the mill invisible from this angle, hidden behind the tree line at the end of Copper Creek Road. She had not let herself think about what it would mean to win until there was something to win, because that was how you survived bad stretches, by keeping the calculus close and practical and not letting hope outrun the evidence. Now the evidence said she had a clean deed and a date-stamped discovery declaration and a dismissed injunction, and she let herself, in the car on the descent into Millhaven, feel the full weight of that for the first time. Sylvie was waiting at the diner door when Diana pulled up. She had a look on her face that was not surprise, because Sylvie had stopped being surprised by this story 3 weeks ago. "How did it go?" she said. "They lost." Sylvie made a sound that was something between a sigh and a word and pulled Diana in and hugged her for about 4 seconds, which was not something she'd done before, and then released her and went back behind the counter and poured coffee without being asked, and neither of them mentioned it again. Mara, who had been at Rosie's after school, arrived 20 minutes later and informed them both that she had learned a card game from a boy named Sam, and also that she was hungry and that the diner's pie looked good today. She got the pie and ate it with the satisfaction of someone for whom the day had gone exactly as expected. Diana watched her daughter eat pie in a diner in a town they'd arrived in with nothing, and understood that this, right here, was what winning looked like in its plainest form. Colton's response to the denial was to file a second motion arguing that the contents of the structure constituted mineral rights separable from the real property deed, and that the mineral rights, having never been formally transferred in the estate sale, remained the property of prior claimants. This motion was more creative and required Prentice to bring in a property law specialist named Eduardo Vega from the University of Oregon, who spent most of his professional life writing about exactly this category of dispute. Vega's opinion was 18 pages, and it concluded, with considerable detail and 12 citations, that gold bars stored within a sealed structure on private property for over a century constituted personal property of the structure's owner and not mineral rights in any legally recognized sense, as the gold had already been extracted from the earth and processed before storage. The mineral rights doctrine applied to gold still in the ground. This gold had been in Eli Vance's possession, in a room he built, on shelves he installed, since 1889. It was as much a part of the real property as the shelves themselves. Prentice filed the opinion, and the second motion died. The news story ran on the third week. Not a Portland outlet, not initially. A young reporter from the Astoria Budget who'd heard about the assayer's visit and made the connection to the deed transfer, and had driven to Millhaven on a Tuesday, and stopped at the diner first. Sylvie had given him coffee and told him nothing useful, which she considered a service to Diana. But he'd also stopped at the county recorder's office and pulled the public records, which were public, and had assembled enough of the story from documents alone to publish something that was accurate in its facts and remarkable in its details. Single mother buys flooded mill for $300. Sealed chamber beneath the structure contains gold bars and specimens worth $11 million. Prior legal challenge from Portland developer dismissed. The story was picked up by the Oregonian the following day. By the day after that, it had been linked from 3 national news aggregators. Millhaven, which had been declining quietly for 30 years, woke up to a dozen unfamiliar vehicles parked on Main Street and a television news crew setting up outside the diner. Sylvie handled this by serving coffee and declining every interview. Pete handled it by parking his truck across the mill's gravel track and sitting in the cab for the better part of 2 days, visible to anyone considering driving up uninvited. Diana handled it by not talking to anyone except Prentice and Holt, and, eventually, one reporter. The reporter was from the Oregonian, a woman named Grace Cho who had covered economic inequality and property law for 12 years, and who had, by the time she called Diana, already read every public document in the case and understood its implications better than most of the outlets that were republishing the budget's original story. She asked 3 questions before Diana agreed to an interview, and the questions were good enough that Diana understood Grace Cho had done the work. They spoke for 2 hours in the mill, Mara at school for the first day of her formal enrollment at Millhaven Elementary, the cooling chamber sealed below them. Diana told the truth. She was specific about the numbers and the legal sequence and the timeline of Ruth's choices. She was specific about Colton Properties and the fraud she'd documented and the complaint she'd filed and the civil case now underway. She was specific about $42 in a church parking lot on a November morning. Because the truth had more weight than any version she could have shaped, and she had learned by now that the truth was the only thing she had that no one could take away. The Oregonian story ran on Saturday, and it was longer than Diana had expected, and it was careful about what it said, and it was accurate on every point she could check. The headline was plain: Portland developer faces fraud charges as Oregon mother claims $11 million in hidden gold. Colton Properties issued a statement through Hadley Crane and Weston calling the civil complaint frivolous and the coverage irresponsible. The statement did not address the contents of the complaint, which was itself a kind of answer. 2 days after the Oregonian story, the Oregon Attorney General's office issued a press release announcing that the fraud complaint originally filed by Diana Reyes, 49 days before, had been formally accepted for prosecution and that a grand jury would be convened. The press release did not mention that the timing was connected to the story in the newspaper. It did not need to. Prentice called Diana the morning the press release went out, and her voice had the quality of controlled satisfaction that belongs to lawyers who have spent years building cases and understand the difference between a story that has started moving and one that is still stuck. The FBI financial crimes referral, she said, had been assigned to an agent in the Portland field office that same week. 2 of the shell company associates, upon learning that the complaint had expanded to include federal wire fraud implications, had contacted the AG's office independently. They were cooperating. 8 years of systematic fraud. 2 cooperating witnesses. A grand jury convened. Colton Properties stock, which was privately held but whose notional value was tracked in commercial real estate circles, dropped by 1/3 in the 2 weeks following the announcements. 3 institutional lenders who had been financing Colton's Clatsop County acquisitions froze their facilities pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Evergreen Pacific Holdings filed for dissolution in Delaware. The 12 Clatsop County parcels, acquired over 18 months at below-market prices, were frozen by court order pending a review of whether the acquisition process had involved the same fraudulent inducement documented in the civil complaint. The Harrow family, who had sold 3 acres for $9,000 against a $41,000 assessed value, called Prentice's office on the Thursday after the freeze order. Their call was one of 7 that week from Clatsop County residents who had sold property to Evergreen Pacific Holdings or related entities and had questions about whether those transactions were subject to the same review. Diana had not expected this. She'd understood that the case would affect Colton and his companies. She hadn't fully processed what it meant for the community where those companies had been operating. She sat with this for a day, and then she drove to the Harrow property with Pete, 20 minutes east of Millhaven on a flat stretch of farmland where the creek drainage leveled out into the kind of land that grew good feed corn in better years. The 3 acres Evergreen Pacific Holdings had bought were on the south edge of the property, a creekside parcel that had been in the Harrow family since the 1950s. The man who came to the door was 63, weathered in the specific way of someone who had spent decades working land and watched the margin of that work get thinner every year until it disappeared. His name was Kenneth Harrow. He looked at Diana with the wariness of someone who had recently learned that the person who bought his land was under federal investigation and who was not yet sure what that meant for him. She told him what Prentice had told her to say, that the legal review of Evergreen Pacific Holdings acquisitions was ongoing, that the outcome would depend on the findings, and that anyone who believed their sale had involved misrepresentation or undue pressure could contact the AG's office directly. Then she said something Prentice had not told her to say, because she understood it was true and because the accounting voice that had been her professional identity for 8 years was very clear about what the numbers meant. If those 3 acres are returned to you through the review, she said, the legal fees to make that happen are something I would be willing to help with. Kenneth Harrow looked at her for a long moment. She'd driven 40 minutes to his front door. She had no obligation to be there. He knew her name from the newspaper and understood that she had other things occupying her attention. He said, why? She thought about the right answer. There were several. The one she gave was the one that felt most accurate. Because someone arranged things so I would have options when I had none. I'd like to do the same for someone else while I can. He didn't say anything more that day. But he didn't close the door either, and a week later his name appeared on the list of Clatsop County residents who had contacted the AG's office independently, and Prentice added him to the portfolio of cases attached to the Colton investigation. Back in Millhaven, the mill was becoming something. Not through any single decision, but through the accumulation of smaller ones, made over the weeks following the hearing and the news coverage and the grand jury announcement, as Diana worked through what the inheritance meant in practical terms. Aldrich had completed his formal written valuation and delivered it in a sealed envelope that Diana had held for 2 days before opening, as if the act of reading it would make it more real than it already was. The figure was $11.8 million at current market, assuming bullion sold at spot price and specimens sold as a group. Aldrich attached a note recommending she hold the specimens for 6 months and sell individually at auction, where he projected a figure between 14 and 17 million. The ledger's historical value he'd referred to the Oregon Historical Society, which had responded with an expression of significant interest and a request to discuss acquisition on terms agreeable to the owner. $11.8 million. Diana sat with the valuation in the loft of a building she owned for $300 and thought about what Eli Vance had built and what Ruth Vance had spent her life looking for and what she herself had arrived here with, which was $42 and a child and no plan past arriving. She made a list. It was the 4th list she'd made since arriving in Millhaven, but this one was different because this one was not about survival. This one was about what came after survival, which turned out to be harder to think about than survival itself. First on the list, Sylvie's credit account at Tom Greer's hardware store, which currently stood at $470. Diana paid it in full and paid it in cash, and Tom Greer looked at the bills and then looked at her and said nothing at all, which was the right thing. Second, Pete's pump and generator rental, which Pete had never brought up and which Diana had calculated at 2 weeks of standard commercial rates. She put a check in an envelope and left it on the passenger seat of his truck while he was inside the mill, helping her reinstall the last of the east wall panels. He called her that evening and told her the amount was too high. She told him she'd had an accountant look at it. He was quiet for a moment and then said she'd get no argument from him. Third, Garth's foundation assessment, which had been done on Pete's goodwill and had never been invoiced. She tracked down Garth through Pete and delivered the check in person. He looked at it and said it seemed about right. Fourth, and this one she thought about for 3 days before acting on it. She called the Oregon Historical Society and told them the ledger was available for acquisition at a price to be determined, with one condition. The condition was that the acquisition agreement include a provision formally crediting the discovery and preservation of the document to Ruth Agnes Vance of Millhaven, Oregon, who had spent 30 years ensuring that Eli Vance's record of his operation survived long enough to be found. The Historical Society's director, a woman named Patricia Osei who had a careful and respectful voice, said that this kind of attribution was entirely consistent with their documentation practices and that she was moved by the story. The acquisition agreement was finalized 3 weeks later for $270,000, and the ledger went to Portland in a conservation case, and the credit line on every display and catalog entry read, identified and preserved through the dedicated research of Ruth Agnes Vance, Millhaven, Oregon. Fifth on the list, Mara's school enrollment fee, which was nothing because Millhaven Elementary had no enrollment fee, but which led Diana to a conversation with the principal about the school's music program, which had lost its funding 3 years before when the county cut the arts budget and which had been informally maintained by one teacher doing double duty for no additional pay. Diana wrote a check that funded the music program for 5 years. The principal held it for a moment and then said, with the practiced restraint of an educator who'd learned not to show too much feeling in front of parents, that this would mean something to a lot of children. Mara came home that week and told Diana that there was a girl in her class named Addie who could play 3 instruments, and that Addie had been told the music program was starting again, and that Addie had cried. She relayed this information with the gravity it deserved. The mill's restoration took 6 weeks and cost more than Diana had estimated, which was something she had expected because restoration always costs more than estimated, and because this particular restoration was being done properly, the way Eli Vance had built the original, without shortcuts or speed compromises. Pete oversaw the work with the assistance of a contractor from Astoria named Tim who had done historical building preservation before and understood the difference between making something look old and respecting what it actually was. The wide plank floors were refinished in place, not replaced. The water wheel on the creek side, which had not turned in decades, was repaired by a millwright Pete found through 3 phone calls, a man who turned out to be the last practicing millwright in Clatsop County, and who wept briefly upon seeing the original wheel mechanism in the condition it was in, then composed himself and got to work. The electrical system was brought up to code with care taken to route the wiring inside the walls in a way that preserved the original structure. The cooling chamber below was stabilized and secured with a new hatch system that allowed access while protecting the contents pending their formal transfer to storage. Garth came back 3 times during the restoration, each visit unprompted, to check on aspects of the foundation work that he'd been thinking about since his original assessment. He made suggestions that improved the drainage around the base of the building by a method that Diana did not fully understand, but that Pete called elegant and that Garth called obvious, which told her something about the difference between people who were good at things and people who understood that they were good at things. Darlene stopped by most Thursday afternoons, ostensibly to see how the work was going, but actually, Diana understood, to see the building being restored and to be able to tell people in town what it looked like, because the town had an investment in this story that went beyond Diana's ownership of a specific parcel. Millhaven had been losing things for 30 years. The mill coming back was not a reversal of that, but it was something. And the something mattered in ways that were hard to quantify, but that showed up in the way people talked about the valley when Diana was around, a slight lift in what had previously been flat acceptance. The gold bars were moved in a process that took 2 days and involved Aldrich, a precious metals transport company from Portland, an armed security detail, and considerable paperwork. They went to a bonded vault facility where they would remain until Diana made the decisions about liquidation that Prentice and Holt and Aldrich all had opinions about, and which Diana was taking her time with, because taking her time was something she could do now. The specimens she kept for the moment. Aldrich's recommendation to hold them had the weight of expertise behind it, and she trusted expertise when it had been earned, which it had been. They sat in the cedar box on the shelf in the restored mill, in the room that had once been mud and was now clean and old and solid. And sometimes on quiet evenings when Mara was doing homework in the loft, Diana would open the box and look at the branching crystal specimen in whatever light the windows offered, and it would do what gold does. And she would think about Eli Vance crouching in the dark of his sealed chamber, placing it in the felt compartment with the same care that someone puts into a thing they intend to last. On a Saturday in early February, 3 months after Diana had first driven down the gravel track toward the mill, she took Mara down the stairs to the cooling chamber for the second time. The first time Mara had been down, briefly, was during the inventory process. This was different. This was quieter. Diana brought 2 flashlights and the cedar box and Eli's letter in its oilskin wrapping, and they sat on the stone floor of the empty chamber, the iron shelves bare now of everything except the memory of what they'd held, and Diana read the letter aloud. Mara listened with the attention she brought to things she understood were going to matter to her for a long time. When Diana finished, Mara sat with it for a moment. He was scared they'd take it, she said. He was worried about what he'd found. Yes, but he made it beautiful anyway. She meant the shelves, the chamber, the carved stone stairs. He didn't just hide it. He built something. Diana looked at the iron shelves along the north wall, empty now but still solid, each bracket driven into the dressed stone with the precision of someone who expected them to hold for a very long time. He built something, she said. That's right. Mara turned the cedar box over in her hands. What are you going to do with all of it? Diana thought about all the lists she'd made. About the music program and the hardware store account, and the Harrow family's 3 acres, and the ledger in its conservation case at the Historical Society. About the fraud case moving through grand jury proceedings in Portland. About Prentice calling twice a week with updates that were increasingly specific about dates and charges, and the cooperating witnesses who were describing 8 years of systematic fraud in the kind of detail that made prosecutors happy. Some of it I'll keep, Diana said. Enough to make sure you never have a night like the ones we had in the parking lot. Enough to make sure this building stays standing and stays ours. And some of it goes back out. To who? To people who need a door left open for them. The way Ruth left one for us. Mara considered this with the seriousness it deserved. And then she said, "Can I name it? The thing that helps people. Can I name it after her?" Diana looked at her daughter's face in the flashlight's edge, the same face that had slept in the back seat of the car through the worst of it, the same face that had pressed a small hand against a warm seam in an old floor and said, "I knew we'd be okay." "Yes," she said. "You can name it after her." The Ruth Vance Foundation was incorporated in Oregon in March, capitalized at $1 million as a first tranche, with a stated purpose of providing legal and financial assistance to individuals facing property fraud and predatory acquisition in rural Oregon communities. Prentice sat on the board pro bono. Holt did the incorporation paperwork at half his standard rate and donated the other half back to the fund. Darlene was named to the Community Advisory Committee, as were Sylvie and Pete and Kenneth Harrow, who had agreed to serve after the AG's review had confirmed that his 3-acre sale met the threshold for fraudulent inducement and had returned the parcel to his ownership. He'd called Diana when the determination came through. He didn't say much. He said, "I want to be useful to what you're building. I know this land and I know this county, and I've been watching people get taken for a long time." She'd said she was glad to have him, and she'd meant it. The grand jury indicted Garrett Colton on 11 counts of federal wire fraud, 3 counts of mail fraud, and 2 counts of fraudulent inducement in property transactions in April. The indictment ran to 44 pages. The cooperating witnesses had described the mechanics of the fraud in detail that matched Diana's documentation on every point she could check, which was most of them. Colton's attorney issued a statement. It used the word frivolous. It used the word politically motivated. It said the charges were without merit. Diana read the statement once and recognized the language from the letter his attorney had sent to her landlord 2 years before, when the eviction had been organized with such efficient precision against someone who had no resources to fight back. She had resources now. She thought sometimes about the difference between how this had gone and how it would have gone if she had not bought the mill, if she had taken the women's shelter waiting list and gotten off it in 6 weeks and found a room somewhere, and resumed the kind of precarious life that $42 and a cleaning job described. The fraud complaint would still be in the intake stack. Colton would still be buying land in Clatsop County at prices that only worked if the sellers had no choice. The 12 families who had signed over property to Evergreen Pacific Holdings would still be on the outside of what was legally theirs. That version of events was the one Diana had lived for 49 days, and she understood it not as a failure of will, but as a description of what power actually meant, which was the ability to make the costs of fighting back exceed what most people could pay. Ruth Vance had changed the cost calculation, had changed it specifically and deliberately and at considerable personal expense in the last months of her life. That was what the 2 sentences at the back of the folder meant when Diana held them up to what had actually happened. "I cannot reach you directly, so I am leaving the door open instead." Ruth had done the harder thing, had arranged the circumstances rather than the outcome, had trusted that the right person would find the path and take it. That kind of trust required a specific belief in other people, the belief that someone you'd never met could be counted on to do the right thing if you gave them the chance. Diana sat with the statement for the length of time it took to read it, which was 90 seconds, and then she set it down and went to pick up Mara from school. Mara had made 4 friends. This was her own accounting, delivered with the precision of someone who had done the inventory carefully and was confident in the result. Addie, who played 3 instruments and had cried when the music program came back. A boy named Sam who was interested in bugs and geology and who had shown Mara specimens from the creek bed that she'd identified correctly as containing iron pyrite. A quiet girl named Rosa who sat beside Mara in math and whom Mara described as the best in the class, which Mara meant as a fact and not a complaint. And a 4th friend whose name Diana kept mishearing because Mara said it too fast, and who turned out to be Addie's younger sister. The mill was theirs. clean and old and solid. The water wheel turning again on the days when Pete ran water through the Reyes to test the mechanism. The wide plank floors gleaming under the creekside windows. The cooling chamber sealed and stable and quiet below the millstone pit. Ruth Vance's research folder had been donated to the Millhaven Town Archive, which consisted of 3 filing cabinets in the back of the post office, and Darlene had made a small placard for the drawer that held it. Research of Ruth Agnes Vance, 1990 to 2024. 34 years of patient work, filed and accessible, a record of a woman who had looked carefully and not given up. On the first warm morning in April, 2 days after the indictment, Diana opened the mill before Mara woke up and stood in the main room in the early light. The creek was loud with snowmelt, running high and cold and clear. The millstone sat in its pit. The east wall panel was closed on its hinges. The iron hook on the beam held a row of tools she'd bought over the winter. Hammers and chisels, and a good hand plane she'd learned to use by watching videos in the evenings after Mara went to sleep, working through the techniques slowly, getting them wrong, and then less wrong, and then, occasionally, right. She had not thought of herself as someone who built things for most of her adult life. She'd thought of herself as someone who found the errors in other people's accounting, which was a skill that turned out to be more fragile than she'd understood. A single employer, a single decision made in a leather chair, and the skill became worthless in the market she'd spent a decade building her reputation in. But in the months she'd spent in this building, she had learned something different. She'd learned to read a floor for what it was hiding, to hear the difference in sound between solid stone and hollow space, to hold a flashlight at the angle that catches things other angles miss, to take a door apart and put it back together and trust the joint, to sit with evidence and wait for it to tell her what it meant. These were not the skills she'd planned to acquire, but they were the ones she'd needed. She walked to the millstone pit and crouched at the edge and looked at the corner where Mara had knelt 4 months ago and felt warmth coming through a seam. The floor was clean. The seams were sealed now, properly. Pete had caulked them after the chamber contents were moved, but Diana could still see the outline of the hatch and the planking, would always be able to see it now that she knew it was there. The floor knows more than it says. She'd thought about that sentence so many times that it had become something she carried the way you carry a tool you reach for automatically. She'd thought about it in the context of the mill, and in the context of her own life, and in the context of Ruth Vance, spending 30 years looking for something she never quite found, but found a different way to reach anyway. The floor knows more than it says. It meant, look again. It meant, what looks settled isn't always. It meant, the evidence is there if you are patient enough and careful enough and willing to get down on your knees in the mud and look. She'd spent 2 years at Colton Properties finding the errors that nobody else found, because she looked at numbers the way Ruth had looked at this building, with the specific attention of someone who understood that things hid themselves and could be found. She'd found them, and finding them had cost her everything, and then had led her here. Mara's footsteps came from the loft ladder, unhurried, morning footsteps, the particular sound of a child who does not yet feel the urgency of the day pressing on them. She appeared in the hatch of the loft and climbed down and crossed the main floor and stood beside Diana at the edge of the pit. "Mom," she said, "you're doing the thing where you stare at the floor. I know. Addie wants to know if I can come over Saturday. Her mom makes bread." Diana looked at her daughter, 8 years old and 4 friends, in a school 3 blocks away in a town she'd arrived in with $42 and no plan past arriving. "Yes," she said, "you can go Saturday." Mara nodded, satisfied, and went to find breakfast. The creek ran loud outside. The mill held its old, patient silence around them. The water wheel turned on the far wall in the current that came down from the snow melt in the high hills, the same hills where men had carried gold dust down to Eli Vance's door for 50 years, the same hills where Mara's friend Sam collected creek specimens and said the iron pyrite was everywhere if you knew to look. Diana stood up. She got her hand plane from the iron hook on the beam. There was a section of wallboard near the north window that she'd been working on for 2 weeks, a warped piece of old fur that had come from somewhere in the building's original fabric, salvaged when Pete did the restoration, too good to discard. She'd been flattening it by hand in her spare time, learning the feel of the blade against the grain, learning to read the wood the way she'd been learning all winter to read other things. It was slow work. It required attention and patience and a willingness to go back over the same ground multiple times. But when the surface came up clean and the grain opened and the wood showed itself for what it was something she'd made with her own hands, and that was a kind of knowing she hadn't had before. Mara appeared in the kitchen doorway with a cereal bowl. Watching. "Can I try?" she said. Diana looked at the hand plane and then at her daughter, and made room at the workbench. Eli Vance had built this mill at 26 with the intention of making something out of nothing. Ruth Vance had spent 30 years in the same building trying to understand what he'd left behind, and at the end had found a way to pass the question on. Diana Reyes had arrived here with $42 and a child and a manila envelope, and had gone down into the dark and come back up with something she hadn't known to look for. She put the plane in Mara's hands. She covered her daughter's grip with her own, showing her the angle, the pressure, the direction of the grain. "You go with it," she said, "not against it." Mara made her first pass. Too much pressure, the blade catching. Diana adjusted her hand on the tool. Again, lighter this time. The second pass came clean. Mara looked up at the curl of wood coming off the board and the smooth line left behind, and the look on her face was the same one she'd had in the pit on the 14th day of their time at the mill, when she'd felt warmth rising through a cold floor on a November afternoon in Oregon and understood, before she had the language for it, that something was about to change. Again, Diana said, and Mara made the third pass, and the fourth, and the fifth, each one cleaner than the last. Her hands learning what hands learn when you give them enough time and something worth making. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.